Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to impartially investigate the complex theological frameworks of a document called Questioning Preterist Ideas. We're breaking down this fascinating historical tension between AD 70 and AD 36. Think of this as a map of a debate that centers entirely on one huge question: when exactly did biblical prophecy reach its finish line? So let's dive right into the foundational text. This document lays out a really rigorous, detailed atavist critique of a framework known as full preterism. As an explainer, our goal here is to neutrally test the 7 load-bearing claims made in this text against the historical and scriptural evidence it presents. We're not picking sides here, we're just unpacking the arguments, exactly as they're laid out so you can see the architecture of the debate for yourself.
Now, both of these views share an interesting baseline: the conviction that biblical prophecies were largely fulfilled in the early centuries of the Common Era, rather than being pushed off into some distant, indefinite future. But the crucial friction point we're analyzing today is when exactly that timeline ended. Full preterism argues that all prophecy was fulfilled by AD 70, right with the destruction of the Second Temple. The atavist position, on the other hand, extends that timeline just a bit further, arguing the true completion happened at the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt in AD 136.
To unpack this dense critique, we'll follow this roadmap: the eschatological divide, identifying the Fourth Kingdom, the AD 136 terminus, the prophetic timeline, and finally, the transcendent destiny. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The eschatological divide.
To really understand this debate, we have to look at specific Greek terms, like parousia. In the Hellenistic world, this wasn't just a metaphor for a historical process. It was actually a highly technical term for a royal visit. It implies a personal, physical arrival that requires actual, perceptible divine action. The God of Israel has a centuries-long pattern of showing up personally, right? Whether it's eating with Abraham at Mamre or appearing to Moses. The document argues that reducing this vocabulary to a purely invisible historical metaphor actually severs the New Testament from its own established patterns. Moving on to Section 2, identifying the Fourth Kingdom.
So, was the Fourth Kingdom of Daniel actually the Roman Empire? Well, the text points out a massive mathematical problem with that. The Eastern Roman Empire stood all the way until 1453. That is a 1,383-year discrepancy between the prophesied demolition and Rome's actual fall. That's huge. Instead, the author makes a strong case that the Hasmonean-Herodian state is the real Fourth Kingdom. Why? Because it was demolished completely at AD 70 and then again at AD 136, and it fits the covenantal strictures of Daniel's prophecy perfectly, specifically the forbidden mingling of iron and clay, which lines up with the forced, coercive religious conversions orchestrated by the Hasmonean rulers.
Notice this highly specific list of covenantal inheritances that the little horn of Daniel 7 fought for. We're talking about the land promises, the Davidic throne, the priestly office, the national identity, and the messianic hope. The Roman Empire had absolutely zero interest in these things. Rome was polytheistic and pragmatically religious. They honestly didn't care who the true heir to the Davidic throne was. Therefore, the argument goes, the conflict must describe an intramural, internal covenantal dispute about who the true people of God are, a dispute Rome was merely the instrument of, not the main subject.
This brings us to Section 3, the AD 136 terminus. It all really comes down to the Hebrew word napots from Daniel 12:7, which translates to a terminal shattering, breaking something into pieces beyond any possibility of reassembly. While AD 70 was undeniably catastrophic, was it truly terminal? The Jewish establishment actually survived. They reorganized rapidly and maintained their legal and religious structures. Therefore, the atavist critique argues that AD 70 actually falls short of the absolute final shattering required by the word napots.
To really grasp the difference in scale here, look at the First Jewish-Roman War in AD 70. Simon Bar Kokhba commanded roughly 40,000 soldiers, a significant force for sure, but still somewhat local to Judea.
Now, fast forward to the Bar Kokhba revolt in AD 136, and that number explodes to a staggering 400,000 soldiers, drawing from communities all across the diaspora. To put that into perspective, this represents a much more accurate fulfillment of the massive, world-spanning Gog and Magog conflict described in Revelation, a scale that the earlier conflict of AD 70 just simply doesn't match.
As we can see on this timeline, organized persecution and conflict actually persisted long after AD 70. Within living memory of the temple's destruction, around AD 85 to 90, the Birkat Hamonem was formulated. This was a liturgical mechanism specifically designed to exclude Jewish Christians from the synagogue.
A completely shattered people wouldn't be able to organize such institutionalized exclusion. This tension culminated in AD 136, where Emperor Hadrian didn't just defeat an army, he legally erased Judea from Roman maps, banned Jews from their own city, and literally plowed Jerusalem as a field, fulfilling the agricultural sentence pronounced by the prophet Micah.
Which shifts us into Section 4, the prophetic timeline. The atavist case builds heavily on these four Greek terms, arguing that each of them linguistically requires a personal divine agent who is physically and visibly present. An epiphania that reveals nothing, or a parousia where the king stays home, contradicts the very definition of the words. The point here is that you simply cannot substitute historical proxy events, like Roman military operations, for vocabulary that specifically demands a personal visible arrival.
And this builds into a fascinating logical paradox. If the millennium occurred before AD 70, we're looking at a chronological contradiction. In Revelation 20, Satan is described using the absolute strongest Greek vocabulary for physical restraint, chained, locked in a bottomless pit, sealed away as a bound prisoner. Yet the apostles writing during that exact same era constantly describe Satan as an active, roaming predator, a roaring lion, and the god of this world. How can a completely bound and sealed prisoner simultaneously hold a throne and actively stalk his prey?
Finally, we reach Section 5, the transcendent destiny.
Here's where we get to the philosophical and theological stakes. If all prophecy expired in AD 70, what happens to the transcendent destiny of the believer in the afterlife? Consider this fascinating detail about optical physics. The 12 foundation stones of the New Jerusalem listed in Revelation are strictly anisotropic gemstones. Under pure, intense light, they remain brilliant, whereas isotropic stones, like diamonds, actually go dark. The author argues that finding this highly specific 19th century optical physics in a 1st century text suggests a description of a real specific place built for a transcendent existence, not just poetic decoration.
This leads directly to the document's capstone argument based on a very famous declaration by Jesus: "I am the resurrection and the life." This is a present tense, permanent identity declaration. It's not a prophetic timetable event. It's a statement of permanent ontological reality. The argument is that you simply cannot put an expiration date on an I am statement. Ultimately, this atavist critique leaves us with a truly profound question to explore. Does extending the prophetic timeline by just 66 years completely change the transcendent hope of the biblical text? Closing all categories at AD 70 risks leaving the believer with nowhere to go, while the AD 136 terminus points to a real, waiting New Jerusalem. Which framework best honors the promises of the ancient text? That is for you to investigate next. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep looking at the evidence.